Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. In the first hour today, we're going to be talking about how to defend the Christian faith and how to deal with doubt. So often we talk about here on Point of View that we want to help you be able to articulate a biblical worldview and also know how to defend a biblical worldview, and that certainly is in the area of apologetics. But we're also going to get into this area of doubt. Young people have doubt. Old people have doubt. A lot of people don't know what to do with it or how to address it, and maybe some simply say, just need to have more faith. Don't need to have doubt. That's just an unbiblical idea. Well, I think we're going to learn a little bit more about that today. As we have in studio with us, Sarah Geis. She received her master's degree in the philosophy of religion from Denver Seminary and is now actually pursuing a PhD work in the philosophy of religion at the University of Birmingham. She and Doug Groteis, who've been on the program with us many times before, have also founded the Gordon Lewis Center for Christian Thought and Culture at Denver Seminary. She teaches at Denver Seminary, also teaches at the Community College of Aurora, and joins me now in studio. Sarah, great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We have mentioned your name before because on a number of occasions we've talked about the International Society of Christian Apologetics, and you've spoken at it at a number of different venues. And of course, I have always appreciated the fact that you are really thinking about how to minister to people that have some very significant issues. And one of those, of course, is doubt. But talk about this. To me, that's always been important, but in this 21st century world, it's really important today.
It is. What I do is, even though my degree is in philosophy, I use philosophy in order to be able to help people know how to go about defending their faith,
yes,
how to go about defending, if it's in the secular context, which when I teach at a community college, not necessarily their faith, but defending their assumed beliefs.
Right.
So what I'm trying to do in teaching anytime or in writing is to get people to equip themselves to then back up and ask, what have I assumed to be true that maybe does not have the support that I thought it did? And when you test your beliefs like that, the things that survive are the things that are worth your allegiance. And so the things that don't survive, you've put false hope in, and you need to discard it anyway. So I try to motivate people in the Christian world to address their faith with this sort of apologetic disposition or mood. And then in the secular world, I do pre-apologetics and try to use philosophy to get them to figure out what is true and then get them prepared, get the ground prepared for apologetics later on.
I would think most people have probably heard the phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living.
Socrates.
But it does seem to me that as you look at people in your age group, since I'm a little bit older than you, but even in my own age group, there are a lot of people that have unexamined lives, right?
That is very true. The unexamined life is the easy life. And it is the view that most people just default into, where how you were raised is who you are. It's the unexamined life tends to produce people who say, I'm a Protestant because my parents were Protestant. Mm-hmm. I'm a Catholic because my parents were Catholic. Or I'm not a Protestant because my parents were Protestant. Something along those lines. It's a reaction to life and not an examined, deliberate stance where you have tested the ground for solid for its solid nature.
You know, one of the things that we've noticed is the real need for apologetics, the need for being able to defend the Christian faith. And I've even noticed that the cover of Christianity Today a while back had Nancy Pearcey and a number of other apologists. Some of us at International Christian Apologetics said your name should have been there, your picture should have been there as well. But there are lots of need today to recognize that we really, whether we're black or white, male or female, Jew or Greek, whatever, we all really need to know how to defend our Christian faith. And it seems to me that if we don't, and even if we do, sometimes doubt's going to actually slip in, isn't it?
It is, because doubt is simply an unfed or an anemic sort of belief. So it's something that belief has to be present first in some way, and then what doubt is the holes or the lack of support showing up, showing itself. Or there might be support, but it's weak support, and you realize that. Or you wonder what your support, whether or not your support is actually strong. And so doubt, in a sense, is on the one hand seen as a problem in a lot of people's views, but then on the other hand, it provides an opportunity for us to back up and strengthen our foundation.
Yes. You know, we had William Lane Craig on a while back, and you, of course, know him and have actually been corresponding with him and are going to go to a school where he has a degree.
That's true.
And he has suggested on air that sometimes when you have a doubt or you have a question or you feel like you've found maybe a contradiction in the Bible or whatever it might be, that it would be really helpful for your Christian growth to, instead of walking away from it or simply trying to gin up some kind of faith about it, or maybe try to think about something else instead, to actually investigate that. And at the end of that investigation, you'll have a stronger faith. And it seems to me that doubt is not something to be avoided. Doubt could be seen as an opportunity or a challenge to actually strengthen our Christian faith.
That is absolutely true. Faith has even been, ever since the time of Martin Luther, considered part nature to it. And one of those is knowledge. The other one is assent, which is the belief that the knowledge is actually true and is going to be pertinent for life. And then what flows out of that is trust. And you cannot, the idea in this tripartite analysis is that you can't have the trust piece unless you have assurance of the truthfulness of what you believe.
Yes. And so again, if we start with the assumption that the Bible is true, then when we run into a difficulty, we don't walk away and say the Bible's not true. I know we're probably going to talk about Bart Ehrman and all sorts of skeptics as we get into this today, but recognize that we start with that conviction and then we look for answers. And Dr. Norman Geisler has written all sorts of books, for example, on alleged contradictions of the Bible or Bible difficulties. Well, he always starts with the assumption that the Bible is inerrant. And if you start with that assumption, then when you run into a problem, you don't throw out inerrancy, you try to figure out an answer. And so that maybe gives us a little bit of a way to deal with this issue of doubt, doesn't it?
It does. You need to understand how to prioritize your views and which views that you have affect other views. And that's why philosophy, at least in the very basic level, is important. Just a basic understanding of logical processes. I don't even care that people know the names of logical fallacies or arguments or anything like that. But if we train ourselves to be consistent in our thinking, that is what is necessary. That's what philosophy is after, and that's what's necessary for ultimately thinking through hard issues and recognizing what your range of possibilities are when you come across a problem.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, continue our conversation today with Sarah Geis about this whole idea of ways Christians mishandle doubt. Do we have doubters in the Bible? Well, of course we do. And how do we maybe learn some vicarious lessons from them? And how do we deal with the doubt that we have or our children have? We're going to talk about that right after these important messages.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The latest undercover videos concerning abortion released last week joined the abortion expose videos done by Lila Rose and Live Action. In the past, she and her group have caught Planned Parenthood officials taking money so that they could abort more black babies and covering up the crimes of sexual predators who preyed on young girls. The latest videos of a Planned Parenthood executive illegally harvesting fetal organs should be as no surprise, but some people were actually shocked. One picture on Facebook had the caption, "Murder 300,000 babies and nobody bats an eye. Sell the body parts and everybody loses their mind." So let's get back to basics. The abortion business is a business. It receives $528 million in government funds annually. Its financial footprint is the same size as that of the NCAA, and it kills 1/3 babies every year. The video showed Dr. Deborah Nucatola, Senior Director of Medical Services at Planned Parenthood, explaining how to perform a partial birth abortion so that the maximum number of organs can be harvested and sold. She says, "We've been very good at getting heart, lung, liver, so I'm not going to crush that part. I'm going to basically crush below. I'm going to crush above. I'm going to see if I can get it all intact." Some of the video sounds like a dialogue for Hannibal Lecter. The legal issue is simple. Trafficking in fetal body parts is a federal crime. Let's have a full investigation to find out what is discussed on the video and whether it's taking place and who is responsible. You know, Michelle Malkin had a good question in her column. She said, "What kind of country do we live in where law-abiding businesses are fined, threatened, and demonized for refusing to bake gay wedding cakes, but barbaric baby butchers are hailed by feminists, Hollywood, and a president who asked God to bless them?" You have to wonder what kind of country we've become. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about the subject of doubt, and if you've had doubt, probably you have. Certainly how to deal with that. You perhaps, if you are sending a young person off to college, will see that they will have doubt because they will be confronting all sorts of ideas they've never heard before. And if they don't know how to deal with those, that's one of the reasons why we encourage you to do what you can to give some worldview training to these young people. But let's, if we can, Sarah, for just a few minutes, talk about the Bible, because when sometimes I will see and I hear people saying, you know, I was in a Sunday school class and I asked a question and the teacher said, well, you're not supposed to have doubts. You're not supposed to ask those questions. But as I look at the scriptures, there are all sorts of individuals, godly men and women, that have had doubts, right?
That is true. And they are all people who were used by
Yes.
God after the fact or during the fact. And one of the people who is fascinating is Abraham, because we know that in the story where Abraham and Sarah were told that they were going to have a baby and they were far too old for that, we know usually that Sarah laughed and did not take that seriously. But here, what it says is that Abraham fell face first on the ground laughing. So that was rather dramatic.
Yes, even more so than hers. Yeah.
And that shows that he doubted. That
Yes.
was him thinking that was utterly ridiculous.
Yes.
And yet he was considered, we see in Hebrews, a hero of the faith, someone who was called righteous because of his faith. So clearly there's not a dichotomy there between Abraham's faith and that moment of doubt. The moment of doubt did not negate his faith. It was just a moment of weakness, and God used that as an opportunity to show his power
Yes.
and show why he was someone to be taken seriously.
So here, Abraham had doubt because he didn't believe God's power. Let's look at the other extreme. Job has doubt because he's trying to figure out why all of this has befallen him and his family.
Right. Job is someone who cursed the day of his birth. He is not thrilled about what he is going through. The entire book of Job, he's suffering. It's a roller coaster ride that you get taken on reading about Job. And yet he is one, once again, who is considered faithful, is considered a follower, a model follower of God.
Yes. Well, if you want to find out, open up the Psalms, right? I mean, you've got David, you've got the psalmist. You have quite a number of times. I mean, I nearly fell, my foot almost slipped, all those kinds of phrases that are saying, I just about gave up on it. And so doubt is very relevant in the Psalms, isn't it?
It is. It is. That's one of the reasons why one of the Psalms, because it is so raw and so human. And again, David was someone who we would look at some of his Psalms and think, he's complaining. There's one psalm that is entirely negative, that doesn't even end on a positive note. It ends with "darkness is my closest friend."
Wow.
That's rather pessimistic. That's not positive thinking.
Yeah.
And yet, what we also realize is that this is Scripture. This is inspired Scripture.
Yes.
And so the lesson to take out of that is that these are not instances of bad believers. These are instances of people going through difficult times, needing support, and then God giving them the reason to trust him at some point. Or they ultimately do become more solid in the faith, or get called something like David was called, a man after God's own heart, after complaining.
Yes. Wow, very good. One more in the Old Testament. How about Jeremiah? Cursing the day of his birth.
Yes.
This is not a happy one either.
No. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet.
Yes.
Once again, that's not a happy face. That's not someone who was all smiles and positive thinking. And yet, Jeremiah was someone who God chose as his prophet. He chose Jeremiah to reveal who and what God wanted to say. God spoke through Jeremiah in such a way that Jeremiah was able to tell Israel what God was going to do if they did not repent. So Jeremiah hated that role, did not want to be a prophet, and yet knew that God was still in control. So he knew God. He had, in a sense, a direct line to God's revelation, and he still was miserable, and he still doubted that God could actually take care of him personally.
Wow. Well, let's take a couple from the New Testament, maybe two. The first one, of course, John the Baptist, who shows a tremendous amount of faith, but is in prison then, and then wonders whether or not he was following a false Messiah or the true Messiah. And so, again, we can see that even a person who demonstrated a tremendous amount of faith in the New Testament even had doubt himself.
He did. And this is a wonderful thing, too, because this gives us an opportunity to see how Jesus responds to someone who is doubting in the same period of time that Jesus was alive. And one of the things that I want to do is actually read what Jesus says. He's talking about someone had actually come to Jesus, and it was a representative of John, and was asking, are you truly the Messiah? Because John is starting to doubt that. He's in prison. He's done everything he was called to do, and yet he's still suffering. He's not getting accolades. He's not being taken care of, busted out of prison. And Jesus says, go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive, are cleansed, raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who does not take offense at me. And then he goes later on and he praises John as a great person, as a great prophet, as someone who is one in line with the faithful heroes of the faith that we read about in Hebrews.
That's pretty amazing. Well, just one more, and it's the obvious one. If I were to take this microphone, go out and talk to people on the street and say, can you think of anybody in the Bible that had doubt? They're all going to say doubting Thomas, right? And
Yes.
that perhaps illustrates something else, and that is some of the ways in which we malign these figures and actually identify in a negative sense the doubt that Thomas had.
Right. Thomas, if you actually read the passage, it's fascinating because he's not necessarily doing anything wrong, because Thomas was not in the room with the rest of the disciples when initially Jesus appeared to them. So I'm not real sure what we expect of Thomas, because if he's asked to trust his buddies, then that seems to be a misplaced trust. I'm not really sure why we would require that Thomas believes the other disciples that Jesus was raised. Maybe, who knows, maybe they had all conked their heads coming in and on a door beam, a low-hanging door beam or something, but who knows? But what happens is Jesus gives Thomas what he needs.
Yes.
And he does not malign him.
No, he does not, yeah.
He just says, blessed are those who believe and have not seen.
Right.
But that blessing does not imply a curse. It does not imply any sort of reprimand.
Yeah. And so I think in some respects we can come back and recognize that a healthy skepticism isn't unbiblical. As a matter of fact, that's one thing I think that sets Christianity aside from, say, Islam, for example, where you're not allowed to question, or certain even kind of cults of Christianity. This one says, really, Jesus says, come and see. I invite investigation. And I know the person you're going to be working on in your doctoral dissertation, Descartes, he encouraged a healthy kind of skepticism too, didn't he?
He did. Descartes is someone who we often think of as an arch skeptic, especially in Christian circles. But the irony there is that he was a devout believer, and he was in a context of heavy skepticism. We tend to think that we're in a skeptical age and that's somehow abnormal. Skepticism's been around for centuries, millennia, since the Greeks. Descartes was simply trying to figure out a way to have a conversation that was productive with skeptics to get them to recognize that there are things that they know and can ultimately then start to construct an argument for the existence of God, which is where he was pushing this whole project. So Descartes was wanting to get people to say, look, you may be a skeptic, but your skepticism needs to be used as a tool to actually figure out what you know, how you know it, and then what the next steps are for the sake of getting to truth.
Let's take a break. When we come back, if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about doubt, and we've already talked about what it is, and many characters in the Bible that actually demonstrated that. So it's certainly not just a lack of faith, but it's as a part of, I think, the common human experience. We're going to talk about how to address this and deal with this and make sure that we don't mishandle doubt. We'll continue our conversation with Sarah and with you right after this.
What can you get for $5? In most cases, you can't even get a value meal at a fast food restaurant. But I'll tell you one thing $5 can do. If every listener to Point of View sent just $5 this week, believe it or not, and someone here did the math, Point of View could pay the bills for the next 3 years. That's what the number said. $5, 3 years. That's how many of you there are and how little. The problem is, most of our listeners have never contributed. Never. To make up for those who don't, others give large gifts, hundreds, even thousands, or monthly donations of $30, $65, $100. I don't know what you can do, but I encourage you to do what you can today, even if that's $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Thank you for doing your part for Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212, talking about ways Christians mishandle doubt. Sarah Geis is in studio with us today, and she is teaching at Denver Seminary, also pursuing a PhD in the philosophy of religion at the University of Birmingham. And I might just mention, if you'd like to know a little bit more about her, we have a link to justifiedfaith.com. You click on her picture there, and her most recent video is on a Christian perspective on death, and I've had a chance to watch that, as well as some of the others. We've posted one of her articles that kind of gets into the area of apologetics and deals a little bit with doubt, but we're also going to, maybe as she produces some of this, post that on the website there as well. Okay, how do we deal with that? It seems to me that one of the problems, Sarah, that people have is they don't understand what are the essentials of the Christian faith and what are the non-essentials. And that's one of the reasons why in some cases people have not only doubt, but they actually walk away from the Christian faith. Right.
We have an example of this in a scholar named Bart Ehrman, and he was what he would consider to be a fundamentalist Christian at one time. And what he did was he was interested in textual criticism, the evaluation of manuscripts, in scriptural manuscripts. And what he believed was that inerrancy of Scripture was necessary to be a Christian. And so what happened was he went to Duke and studied very high-level textual criticism, and he found, which is not a shock to any Christian scholar, that the original, a lot of the manuscripts, the old manuscripts that we have little variants, like one has a comma here, or one has, even though there aren't commas in Greek, but you get my drift. And he all of a sudden realized that because there were so many manuscripts that varied, that inerrancy was challenged. And then he got to the point where he thought inerrancy was false, which then, for him, if you have to have inerrancy to be a Christian, he was no longer a believer. Yeah. And he didn't have to do that because, for one, there are good answers to that, and inerrancy, it holds. But even if it didn't, we have people like C.S. Lewis who are not inerrantists, and yet there's no doubt that C.S. Lewis was a believer.
Yes. And I remember hearing you speak on this at the International Society of Christian Apologetics, and it really is sort of the house of cards. Once you have something that is a, quote, non-negotiable, which, by the way, is not a non-negotiable, but you make it such that as soon as that's challenged, it all falls apart, and there's absolutely nothing left. And that's, I think, a really sad commentary on the way sometimes we set people up to fail, or set people up to begin to walk away from their Christian faith, right?
Right. That's true.
Well, again, that's one of those. So again, it seems to me that we certainly have to make sure that we have the right priority of what are essentials and non-essentials. What about this idea of the Enlightenment and modernity? We're going to have Os Guinness on again, and we talk about that sometimes with him. We've talked about it with other individuals. But there's been sort of this mindset that in the Enlightenment, as soon as we started believing in reason, that was it. That was the deal breaker, right?
Right, exactly. And what we have to understand is it is far easier to teach about the Enlightenment by oversimplifying, or teach it about, it's easier to teach about any historical movement by oversimplifying it so that your students can learn generally what the spirit of the age was. But in reality, we have to realize that teaching, that's good for teaching on the one level, but we also have to be prepared to realize that the Enlightenment was a very large movement, and it was primarily characterized by the distrust of authority. Now, that can be a good thing when you're dealing with a very heavy-handed Catholic Church that does not want its members to be learned and to be literate. So, in a sense, reason, yes, it gave people reason to be skeptics or reason to be atheists even, but it also gave Christians the ability to own their own faith and to get reasons for their own faith and not believe it just because they got it from a higher authority, or and I mean a higher human authority.
Well, and I think that's one of the problems, because when you have an oversimplification like that, then many people today growing up maybe without a Christian background, they read about some challenge that came from an Enlightenment scholar of some sort, and they go, well, that's enough. Or they've never been prepared in their church to answer any of the questions. So the first time they run into one of those that comes from the age of reason or the age of skepticism or the Enlightenment, they immediately jet into the faith instead of seeing that as a challenge to say, okay, that's worth my investigation, and I need to see whether or not there's a good answer for that.
Right. And the questions that were being asked in the Enlightenment were questions that are deeply human questions. They're questions that were present in the Greeks, in the Greek philosophy period, in the classical Greece. So they're not questions that are Enlightenment bound, but they were freer in the Enlightenment because far more people were literate. Far more people were doubting the authority of the Catholic Church. Yeah. And so when you have that sort of situation, you need, because what we're going to have is people going to college in our generation, in our age, and they're going to read about some of these questioners in the Enlightenment, and they're going to think those people are very smart. And if those people are anti-church and anti-Christian, and Christians are anti-smart people, then I'm going to go with the smart people, which is an oversimplification also, but it's one that we set up in just maligning those figures because they questioned.
Well, and I think we see this today, even though this is a historical period, but we see it even in the 21st century when you have young people that grow up in the church. And in a Sunday school class, maybe they ask a really good question, and the teacher looks and says, no, you're just supposed to have faith. You know, you're not supposed to ask that, Bobby, Johnny, Joni, whatever it is. And they kind of sit on it for a while and wonder about it. Then they go off to college, and they take Philosophy 101. It might as well be called Introduction, or maybe even Indoctrination into Atheism 101. They take a science class, learn about evolution, and they're having all sorts of questions, and they start saying, well, I know these sweet people back at church that love the Lord, but I see these really smart people with their PhDs, so they must know more about this than I do. And so there's a sense in which sometimes that whole experience leads to a jettison of the faith. And so it's not surprising. We send kids off every year to college, and a lot of them give them up on their faith, not because there aren't good answers to the questions being raised, but they've been raised in an environment where asking questions like that almost seems inappropriate.
Right. And there's an analogy that comes to mind there. It's as though we were all sitting in a skydiving airplane, and there's a Christian section, and then there's a non-Christian section. And in both sets, there are backpacks that are available, and the hope is that these backpacks do actually have parachutes in them. And the Christian section has a tendency to say, don't open the backpack, because just trust us that there's a parachute in there. And then the non-Christian section is saying, sure, we're skeptics. Open the backpack, evaluate it, analyze it. And what they'll find is that when that's encouraged, it makes total sense that we're going to have entire generations of people flocking to flocking to the group who's giving them a parachute, even if our parachutes are better and maybe safer in some ways, but we're not letting anyone look at them or look in the backpack and investigate.
Now, all that comes in what is called modernity. Let me, before we take a break here, talk about post-modernity, because in this postmodern world, no one believes in truth or anything like that. So that makes it even more difficult for Christians, because at least when I'm debating somebody that doesn't believe the Bible, we're still using rational arguments to try to show that the Bible is true. But when I run into somebody who says, well, I really don't believe in rational arguments. Of course, they're using a rational argument to say they're not using it, but okay, we'll leave that one aside for just a minute. Then you've got another challenge, don't you? And that's some of the places where, again, we have Christians having real doubt, right?
That is true. When you are dealing with the postmodern mindset, they will often say things like, I'm not interested in proof, or you can't prove that, because the postmodern knowledge only comes from science. Then the postmodernist is saying that viewpoint, which is seen to be people think it's the modern viewpoint largely. The postmodern will say you can't know things about the self, about my psychological state, about God. So we're just going to say you can't know really anything because you can always doubt scientific findings and scientific tests and those sorts of things. So they take this total skeptic view and don't know what it would even take to reason, because that's just not an interest of them, and they don't think it actually takes you anywhere.
Yes. We're going to take a break and we'll come back to that. But again, they live in a world where they pretend as if they can't know anything, but they live in the world where they'd better know some things, like
Yes.
Red means stop, green means go, that stepping out in front of a car cannot be a life positive kind of experience, and those kinds of things. But nevertheless, we'll take a break and we'll talk a little bit longer about this issue of how Christians mishandle this subject of doubt and why it's so important for us to think about this from a biblical perspective. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Sarah Geis with us for just a few more minutes, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Probably get to a lot more phone calls in the second hour as we get into some other topics, but again, talking about the ways Christians mishandle the subject of doubt. And just before we get back into that, let me just mention that we have a link to her website, Justified Faith. There is ample justification for belief in the truth of Christianity. And if people wanted to correspond with you, find out a little bit more about what you teach there at Denver Seminary, as well as see some of the blog posts, that's a place to go, isn't it?
Yes.
And also, I would encourage people to be praying for you as you pursue your philosophy of religion at the university. of Birmingham. That's just amazing to me. Just a phenomenal opportunity there. But again, wish you well and all that.
Thank you.
Let's, if we can, just before we run out of time, talk about, we've talked about the modern world and even postmodern world. What about going back to this idea of pre-modernity? It seems to me that there are a lot of people that are saying, I know the answer. We'll go back before the modern world, before the Renaissance, before the Reformation, before the Age of Enlightenment, and that's how we solve these problems. What about that?
Right. You've got people who recognize a problem with over-dependence on science, on what's called scientism, the belief that knowledge can only come from science, which in and of itself is not a scientific claim. So that's interesting. But they'll think often, and in the church too, I've seen this, they'll say, well, the answer then to that is not to go postmodern, but to go pre-modern, before our dependence on science. Because instead of science being our authority, it was God that was our authority. But interestingly, while that sounds pious, it sounds good to say, well, way back, we had to depend on God because we didn't have technology and science and all those sorts of human creations and products of rational thought. Really, when we look at that, you have to realize, first of all, even in the pre-modern period, there were skeptics, there were atheists,
quite a lot.
There were pantheists. There was still just as much of a culture of disagreement, just not as mixed in as it is now, because we're globalized today. But at the time also, even as if you assume that everyone had basically more or less a Christian worldview, what good is that Christian worldview if they don't really believe it? They just use the language, and they use language that they don't necessarily understand because they're either not literate or they are literate, but they have a couple of pages out of a book that's been handed down to them for generations, or maybe they have no books and they wish that they did. But it's not the same sort of situation as we like to think. We like to think, oh, well, it was a much more godly time. It was a time that was not there was not the possibility of asking constructively skeptical questions. And then if you did ask skeptical questions, you did not have a very high likelihood of being treated well by your society, or a very high likelihood of actually having those questions answered. You would just be consigned to be a skeptic for the rest of your life because either you couldn't read or there weren't resources available. So that doesn't actually, upon further evaluation, the pre-modern answer is not a good answer at all. It was not necessarily a good thing. We're going to have struggles in every age, and we need to figure out how to overcome them because truth is truth regardless of when we were born.
Well, and I think it's interesting that we sometimes have this kind of idea that these were the halcyon days and everything was perfect, but really you go back, even look, and if just take something as simple as reading the New Testament, you can see the Apostle Paul, as well as Peter and others, but we'll just take Paul for a minute. He's dealing with all sorts of issues. He's dealing with Gnosticism. By the time you end the 1st and 2nd century, you're dealing with so many different heretics, so many different kinds of ideas, even surrounding the biblical idea. And then if you realize what was going on in other parts of the world in terms of that, there are almost every kind of cult or philosophy or false belief that was held at that time. So going back to that doesn't solve any of your problems. I think it actually makes it worse, frankly.
Yeah, and that is the context, going back to Descartes, that Descartes arose out of, because he traveled the world as a student. And the reason that he was interested in figuring out how to use skepticism productively, how to create a system of skepticism to actually ask the right questions to end up at truth, is because he got to know skeptics. He got to know people who weren't. People are very intelligent and they're asking good questions, and there's an answer to those questions, but we need to figure out how to open dialogue and welcome the constructive conversation that can eventually end up at truth.
Well, let's talk about some practical applications before we run out of time. And one of those is it would seem to me that any listener right now that's a teacher, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a Sunday school teacher, whether you have a Bible fellowship, whether you have a small group, should be willing to encourage questions. That we've already, I think, demonstrated that lots of the people in the Hebrew Hall of Faith had questions. They had doubts. So doubt is something that you see in the life of John the Baptist. You see it in David. You see it in Jeremiah. You see it in Abraham. I mean, let's just recognize that. So it seems to me that we should be willing to accept those questions, and we should create really a careful and safe environment where individuals who are going to have those questions, especially in this world today, really need to think about where they could ask those questions and give them a safe environment to ask those questions and then give them good answers.
Right, which means that we as teachers, and really I believe that everyone has some sort of teaching platform, regardless of if you are professionally a teacher or not. But as teachers, it is our responsibility to know where to point people. Not just to shut them down because you don't immediately know the answer, but to be able to say, well, I know someone you can talk to, or I have a website you can look at, or maybe I have a book you can read. Although be careful about that, because often in this generation, the younger generations, people just won't read the book. And so you kind of have to be careful and wise about that. But we do need to be able to know where to point people. And if we don't initially know, we can say, well, let me find out for you, and be warm and welcoming to those questions and to people who are being honest with you.
Well, again, I would encourage people to go to your website and many others that we recommend, this one, justifiedfaith.com, but also would challenge some of our young listeners out there to consider whether or not they might want to go to Denver Seminary or somewhere else and have a chance to study with people like you and Doug Groteis and others, and begin to be the apologist for the 21st century. Because if anything, with all the questions out there, that is definitely guaranteed job security, because you will always have questions to answer and always have an opportunity to share your Christian faith. So I appreciate you taking the time to come down here from Denver, join us in studio, and take a little bit of time talking about the way Christians mishandle doubt. Let's see if we can do a better job of handling doubt in the 21st century. Any thoughts before we go?
Well, I want to just make sure that if people listening to me don't remember anything else, just know that blind faith is not biblical faith. Blind faith is something that is analogous to what I brought up before, jumping out of a plane with a backpack that may or may not have a parachute in it. It is not a problem to look into the parachute to figure out, A, is there a parachute in there, or look into the backpack. Is there a parachute in there? And if so, does it have holes in it? Is it functional? So those are questions that are healthy questions. And when they're answered, then we have a far more stable faith, and that stable faith gives us a platform for conviction and ultimately mission.
Yes. Well, the unexamined life is not worth living. So let's examine those lives and let's find good answers. And one of the things we talk about so often here on Point of View is not only helping you articulate a biblical point of view, but knowing how to defend it. So, Sarah, thank you for being one of those individuals that's training us how to do so, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to take a break, and let me encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net. You're going to find out a lot more about what we've been talking about, some great resources. So let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about some of the issues in the news, all that coming up right after this.
If you've been a Christian for any length of time, no doubt you've heard about Jesus feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus took something small and turned it into something big. Recently, someone here at Point of View made an interesting discovery. He did some math and figured out that according to the number of faithful listeners we have, if you and every other listener gave $5, it would help Kerby and the team bring you interviews and commentary for not 3 months, but 3 years. You heard me right. If every listener donates just $5, we'd pay what it costs to bring you this needed information for 3 years. And if you urge a friend to join you, you send 5, they send 5, well, you can imagine the impact. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas. Send $5. Urge a friend to join you. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, we're going to spend some time today looking at some of the stories we've been following. About a half a dozen different stories and issues that we'll be talking about. One in particular, of course, we've raised before. Why is it that most military personnel are not allowed to be armed on military bases? So we'll talk about what has been happening there in Chattanooga and solutions to that. We will also be talking about what has happened to those who actually have refused to perform a same-sex marriage or cater one. We've actually seen some positive news coming out of the owners of Sweet Cakes, Aaron and Melissa Klein. So we'll talk about that. Another story we've been following has to do with what has happened in Iran and the deal with Iran. There were a number of Americans yesterday that packed Times Squares to denounce the Iranian deal, so kind of follow that issue. And then I want to get into the campaign, because there have been some real questions about how to respond to Donald Trump. Some have suggested you just simply ignore him or move on to the questions you want to address, and that's certainly been the response from Senator Ted Cruz. A very different response has come from former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, who has compared Donald Trump to cancer, to the Know Nothing Party, and to maybe even Joe McCarthy. So we're going to get into maybe some of those issues. And then my commentary today has to do with those abortion videos. We know a little bit more about that because we now have another set of videos that have come out. So we'll kind of get into that if we have time. And also talk about an issue we were going to address this hour with Ryan Anderson. He is now going to be on our program next week, but we're going to talk about this issue of how to respond to some of the judicial activism of the Supreme Court as it relates to same-sex marriage. So a lot to cover this hour. And if you'd like to join us on any of these topics at any point, I'm going to open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. Let me take the first one. Why is it that we have most military personnel unarmed? Does this make any sense? And I'd love to hear from some of you that have served in the military. And it surfaces from time to time. You might remember back in November of 2009, where you had the Army Major Nidal Hassan open fire in Fort Hood, killed 13 people. And a lot of people at that time ask, well, why is it that we are not actually giving those people who have demonstrated their familiarity with arms and have probably the best training of anyone other than maybe people in the police force, why do we disarm them? And, of course, that surfaced in 2009. Then more recently, you've had the shootings and, of course, first of all, the Washington Navy Yard. And then, of course, we talked about the shooting the other day with 5 dead. And it turns out that this idea of a gun-free zone, which has oftentimes been blamed on the Clinton administration, really precedes that. And that is that there was a directive that came down in February of 1992, and it was a directive under the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Donald Atwood. And at that time, you have President George Herbert Walker Bush as the president. And so this was an attempt to begin to reduce and eventually essentially eliminate any kind of arms on a military base. And I think we all know the story here. What happens when you have a gun-free zone? Well, what you have is a much more inviting place for someone to actually use any kind of weapon. And this, of course, has been extended, as we've already talked about on this program, to everything from military recruitment centers to various other military locations. And so it turns out that if you look at the actual policy, it says, quote, "The authorization to carry firearms shall be issued only to qualified personnel when there is a reasonable expectation that life or Department of Defense assets will be jeopardized if firearms are not carried." Well, it's pretty obvious that when you're overseas, you want to have arms. But I think it's becoming more obvious with these potential terrorist threats, whether they're a lone wolf threat like we have seen recently, or whether it was an attempt by a group of individuals to go onto a military base, that not having weapons, not having an ability to respond is a dangerous regulation indeed. Now, some have tried to pin this to President Clinton, and the reason they have is that there was a change in the policy from 1992 to 1993, but that was simply one that was sort of a minor modification on the one that had been instituted before. So I'm going to leave it at that and say that we shouldn't say that this was due to President Clinton. I mean, this goes all the way back to President George Herbert Walker Bush. But in light of all that is taking place right now, certainly one question on the table is it time to rethink this policy about whether we would allow individuals who have, in marksmanship classes and in their service in the military, demonstrate that they know how to use these weapons? Does it make any sense to disarm them and have a number of gun-free zones, which makes it all too easy for the next individual, a lone wolf terrorist or a person that is mentally unstable, to actually cause that kind of harm? So one of the questions on the table certainly is this issue of whether or not military personnel should be armed on military bases. Seems like a no-brainer to me, but love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Let's come to this issue of Aaron and Melissa Klein. It seems like almost every week we talk about wheat cakes, who, as we've pointed out, for their violation of discrimination. And so as a result, the Oregon Labor Commission ruled that indeed they would have to come up with $135,000 in damages. Some of you have asked off air, and I think it's even come up on air, but certainly I've watched some of the emails saying, can Point of View do something to help them raise funds? And of course, you know what we've done more recently to help raise some funds to help individuals that were Christians who found themselves having to leave and go into a refugee camp of some sort. And we have been able, through the projects that we have undertaken here, actually been able to raise, we talked about $30,000 and $35,000. I think we're actually up to about $50,000 now that we've been able to raise and to send over so that those individuals might be benefiting. And some people have asked in emails and other forums that are available to us whether we could do something to help Aaron and Melissa Klein. Well, as we pointed out on Friday, they are actually doing quite well, but I thought I'd give you the latest numbers on how well they've done. First, when they actually had to come up with $135,000 and pay damages to the lesbian couple, there was a crowdfunding website established, which was GoFundMe, and that was raising quite a bit of money instantaneously for them. But then because of various gay activists, they were able to convince GoFundMe to actually close down the GoFundMe website section for Aaron and Melissa Klein, but not before they were able to raise $109,000 of the $135,000. And so when we come back, I'll give you the latest numbers, but they've done very well, and that's good news. Let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The latest undercover videos concerning abortion released last week joined the abortion expose videos done by Lila Rose and Live Action. In the past, she and her group have caught Planned Parenthood officials taking money so that they could abort more black babies and covering up the crimes of sexual predators who preyed on young girls. The latest videos of a Planned Parenthood executive illegally harvesting fetal organs should be as no surprise, but some people were actually shocked. One picture on Facebook had the caption, "Murder 300,000 babies and nobody bats an eye. Sell the body parts and everybody loses their mind." So let's get back to basics. The abortion business is a business. It receives $528 million in government funds annually. Its financial footprint is the same size as that of the NCAA, and it kills 1/3 babies every year. The video showed Dr. Deborah Nucatola, Senior Director of Medical Services at Planned Parenthood, explaining how to perform a partial birth abortion so that the maximum number of organs can be harvested and sold. She says, "We've been very good at getting heart, lung, liver, so I'm not going to crush that part. I'm going to basically crush below. I'm going to crush above. I'm going to see if I can get it all intact." Some of the video sounds like a dialogue for Hannibal Lecter. The legal issue is simple. Trafficking in fetal body parts is a federal crime. Let's have a full investigation to find out what is discussed on the video and whether it's taking place and who is responsible. You know, Michelle Malkin had a good question in her column. She said, "What kind of country do we live in where law-abiding businesses are fined, threatened, and demonized for refusing to bake gay wedding cakes, but barbaric baby butchers are hailed by feminists, Hollywood, and a president who asked God to bless them?" You have to wonder what kind of country we've become. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take a phone call because we've already talked about this issue of why most military personnel are not armed on military bases. So before I finish some of the other things, let's get into that issue. Paul in California, you have the floor. What would you like to add?
Hey, well, I'm a Marine. I was stationed down in Camp Pendleton. I actually recently just got out, and I guess the whole issue about the on-base armed guard, I would say, is actually going on. There are armed personnel specifically for certain areas on base, such as Camp Pendleton,
Sure.
where the guard is constantly armed and roving. So there is a level of people being armed, but as for the whole Chattanooga thing, because of that type of service, like being in a recruiting center, that's why I feel like they didn't like it wasn't necessary for them to be armed. But because of these terrorist attacks, that is something that I think is going to be changing soon.
Yeah, and again, I recognize you may not want to arm everyone, and of course there were two attacks, one at a recruiting base, which even so, let's recognize there are people outside of that office that are probably carrying, if it's a concealed carry state, and I'm pretty sure that it was in Tennessee, and certainly would be in the state of Texas and other places. So that, and you have a situation right now where in a couple of places, you've seen this, where you've had individuals that have been part of the so-called self-appointed militia stand in front of these recruiting centers saying, well, if you can't carry arms, we will, which I think that could get us into some trouble real quickly. But I think this directive maybe needs to be reevaluated. It's Defense Department Directive 5210.56. It just seems to me that it should be reevaluated in light of not just what happened in Fort Hood, and not just what happened in Chattanooga, and not just what happened in Washington Navy Yard, but we can put a pretty long list of places where this makes some sense to provide those of you that have demonstrated your ability to use them effectively, and then to put this as another kind of gun-free zone just doesn't make sense to me. But I'd love to hear your comments since you've served in the military.
Right. The issue with, most civilians kind of have a perspective on the military. Yes, we are all trained on it. I can speak for the Marines only as far as our training, but some of those recruiters, like the way they, because what their job entails, not all of them were infantry Marines.
That's true.
So the reality is that they literally only touch their rifle once a year to qualify on it. I'm not saying that in no way does that mean that they don't know that weapon expertly. It's like riding a bike. Once you do it 1,000 times and you've been trained on it, you never forget. I would trust someone that touches their weapon once a year that's a Marine over someone that shoots guns every day.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, first of all, for your service. I appreciate you calling in today.
Awesome. Take care, man. God bless.
Semper Fi. Let's take another call. Lowell in Ohio, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Hi, this is Lowell.
Uh-huh.
And thank you very much. I appreciate the comments that you bring up on the air. But I served in the military and was actually in the military police in Fort Benning, Georgia. And I'm not convinced that everyone on the base needs to carry arms, but maybe specialized squads.
Sure, yeah.
That would accompany, people or companies that go out for physical training where there might be a threat that they could be attacked, and to have specialized squads to be there to protect them.
Well, that makes sense to me. I'm not sure that you want everybody running around with arms, but at the same time, it does seem that certain locations really need that. And again, to read the actual directive, I took the time to dig this up. The directive says the authorization to carry firearms shall be issued only to qualified personnel when there is a reasonable expectation that life or Department of Defense assets will be jeopardized if firearms are not carried. Well, some of these assets are pretty valuable, and certainly life itself is pretty valuable. And at a time when we supposedly have a heightened terrorist alert, I think you could, even using this directive, argue for it. And certainly a lot of people are starting to ask the question, maybe we need to rethink all of the directive. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. That directive itself can be expanded upon. The military did a great job with training for arms, from my perspective, both with rifles and with pistols. But to even enhance or beef up certain other people that are even more specially trained, because there's always a threat to life or to property on any military base.
I would think so, too. Well, Lowell, thank you again for your service, and thank you for joining the conversation today.
Thank you.
If you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Before I get to my next call, let me finish what I was talking about before. Aaron and Melissa Klein, the owners, or were the owners, I guess is more appropriate, of Sweet Cakes Bakery there in Gresham, Oregon. As I pointed out, that they were using the GoFundMe account to help them raise the $135,000 they were going to have to pay in damages. And they were actually able to raise $109,000 of that before GoFundMe shut them down. Now, the rest of the story I wanted to tell you, and then I'm going to take this phone call. The campaign picked up at another crowdfunding site called Continue to Give, and it actually lived up to its name because the campaign reached 250% of its goal. In other words, they have now raised $352,000 of money. So they have been able, first of all, to exceed their initial goal of raising enough for the damages. And this now will allow them to do some other things, perhaps even help some of the lawyers, but certainly with some of the court costs. So the good news is that even though GoFundMe shut the Kleins down, there have been alternative sources. One, of course, as we mentioned earlier, came from Franklin Graham, and they, through Samaritan's Purse, developed something. And then, of course, this crowdfunding site, Continue to Give, They have now raised, the number I have is $352,500, and that number is probably even higher since this came out a couple of days ago. So let me get back to some of the callers that wanted to address that issue. So let me go to Georgia, WLPT. Mike, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for taking my call. I didn't know about the other sources of funding for the fines. I just wanted to help. If you could, them and other folks like Baronell Stutzman, I think is her name, anybody that's having to pay attorneys and pay any penalties, I'd like to try to help them.
Okay, and we'll probably direct you to some of those, but the good news is almost all of them are doing pretty well. Let me take the two that relate to this. Of course, you just heard those of you that want to find a link, we could probably put that up there. It's called Continue to Give. It's a crowdfunding site, and like I said, last time I looked, they raised $352,500, so they've exceeded their goal tremendously, and that will allow them maybe to deal with some other court costs and incidental issues as well. And the other one I thought I'd mention, remember the couple, actually it was a father and daughter, that Memories Pizza. Remember when they had the big debate up there in Indiana about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? And so a reporter went down into that pizza place and said, would you actually cater a wedding? And first the daughter was saying, well, we actually don't, bring pizza to a wedding, but no, I think we'd have a hesitation about that. And so then they had all sorts of people upset with them, and they received even a death threat, and they were forced to really shut their shop down for a couple of days because of the threats that came. Well, in the midst of that, they actually established a GoFundMe page, and they brought in $35,000 just in the first couple of hours, and brought in so much money that the people at Memories Pizza said, we were that. So they actually decided that they were going to send that money to Baronell Stutzman in Richland, Washington, who is the florist that you're talking about. So I'm just full of good news today, and we'll see if we can let people know a little bit more about how they can help some of those other groups. So, Mike, I appreciate the fact that you were actually interested in that, and we'll see if we can maybe post on our website a place if you want to give to help any of these ministries or any of these particular business owners, and we'll let you know more about that as we go along. So thanks for calling in today.
Thank you. I will. Thank you very much.
We're going to take a break, and I might just mention one of the action items we gave to you yesterday, and I talked about it today in my commentary, had to do with these abortion videos. And we now have a number that have come out from the Center for Medical Progress. And each one of them is just one more reason for us, I think, to let our representatives know what we think about this. So if you go to our website right now, under our Take Action item, we give you an opportunity to tell your two senators and your representative what you think about this issue, and we suggest that we should actually call for them to defund Planned Parenthood. And if you've not seen the videos, you want to see them, we've posted those as well. So they're all available on the website, pointofview.net. You can watch them and then take some action. But when we come back, we'll take some more.
What does a hero look like? I remember a woman stricken with MS. She was in a wheelchair, and every week after church, people would get down on a knee and greet her and pray for her. But do you know what caught my eye? The seemingly invisible man behind the wheelchair, silently caring for his beloved, sacrificing for her. In the Bible, Jesus talked about a big giver who had a marching band come with him as he dumped his treasure in the temple coffers. But Jesus saw a woman who gave a tiny gift that was actually huge. If you appreciate Point of View but can't give $30 or $65 or more, well, get this. If every listener gave $5, it would pay our bills for the next 3 years. 3 years. Give $5 today. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Thank you for being our hero.
Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Put a couple of issues on the table. We may not get to all of those today. If we don't, we'll certainly focus on those tomorrow in our Friday weekend edition. One about why is it that military personnel are not armed on certain military bases or recruitment centers, and there are certainly good reasons both ways, and we'll get some of your comments about that. All has to do with the Department of Defense directive that actually came down in the last few months of the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. Some people, I think, have erroneously said that that was during the Clinton administration. It is true that under President Clinton there was a modification of that, but the original order came down actually in 1992. The modification, the Army regulation, came down in 1993. So, again, if you're wanting to blame somebody, that goes all the way back to George Herbert Walker Bush and the Deputy Secretary Donald Atwood. Some of you want to address that issue. We've also talked about what has happened to Aaron and Melissa Klein, because they were required to pay $135,000 in damages to the lesbian couple. And the money that was being raised for them at GoFundMe was closed. But again, they brought in about $109 media that another crowdfunding site called Continue to Give actually would help them to not only reach their goal, but to exceed that and to maybe deal with some of the other expenses. So if you want to address that issue, certainly it is relevant. And of course, we've also talked about this issue of these abortion videos. And just before I take another phone call, let me give you the latest that has come down over this on just the last couple of days. I'm quoting now from Tony Perkins' Washington Update. He said, while Planned Parenthood is being investigated, President Obama is tightening federal funding rules for pro-lifers. He says that's right. After 3 congressional committees and 7 states have launched probes into a possible organ harvesting ring, the White House is not only ignoring the scandal, but focusing its fire on organizations providing real care to women. Here's the point. He says, when the rest of the country's attention is on an organization who may be peddling parts for profit, the president is finalizing rules to stop faith-based groups from getting a dime of federal funding. Their crime? Believing that all life has value and refusing to refer women to groups who disagree. In a jab at organizations like Catholic Charities, Tony Perkins says, the Department of Health and Human Services quietly disqualified pro-life groups from sex trafficking victim grants unless they offer, quote, the full range of legally permissible gynecological and obstetric care, unquote. What does that mean? Abortion referrals. On the other hand, if you aid and abet sex traffickers, the government will happily write your organization a check for $500 million taxpayer dollars. So it's bad enough that our tax dollars, $528 million of our tax dollars, goes to Planned Parenthood. But now, if that's not bad enough, the administration right now looks like it's going to prevent pro-life groups from actually receiving any grants to deal with sexual trafficking unless they provide abortion. Think that through just for a minute. That's just one more of those issues I'm putting on the table today. And if we don't have enough to cover, we can put more on the table, but I suspect most of those will get bumped to tomorrow when we'll get into that in more detail. Let's take some phone calls, and we'll go to Maine. Steve, thank you for calling today. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I think it's important to, well, for one, let me comment on the statement that you made earlier on civilians who are standing outside some of these units now and offering their protection. I think a lot of those individuals, if not all, are probably highly skilled, highly trained, probably mostly prior military.
Yeah, they could be. Yeah, they're probably a militia. And I've looked at a couple of them. Some of them probably know how to handle a firearm probably as well as people in the military. Go ahead.
Exactly. And further on the subject of those types of positions being able to carry firearms in CONUS or in the United States installations, I think that, of course, they would have to have the proper amount of training and qualification to be able to be known that in a stressful situation that they would be able to handle that situation well. But I certainly think that that level of training, especially now with the way things are in the world, needs to be given and utilized.
That's what I would say. I would want to rethink this department directive when George Herbert Walker Bush put it into effect in 1992, February of 1992. A little different world than we find ourselves in right now in 2015, don't you think?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you calling in, and call again. Let's take a few more phone calls because I've got almost a full bank of phone calls. So I want to work our way through that to give as many of you a chance to air your comments on a national program. Let's go to Ohio this time. Phil, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Hi there. Thanks for taking my call. You have a lot of very important issues on the table, and I mean, there's hours and hours of talking about it. But the one I was prepared to talk about was basically the firearms on posts and like recruiters and stuff like that.
Sure.
I feel that it would be okay for I'm a National Guard member myself, and I believe that if they want these people to be competent with their weapons, they need to let them have them on them at all points in time. Provided they're in a combat unit. If they're in a combat unit, chances are they're either A, going to see combat, or B, they've already seen combat. With the amount of shootings that have taken place, I mean, our commander now makes us come to drill and leave drill in civilian clothes. We are not allowed to travel in our uniforms. Our country is really jacked up because overseas we're lions. When we're back here, we're house cats.
Yeah, that's well said.
They declaw us, they defang us. We've got nothing. Overseas, we are equipped to that. We are equipped to the hilt. We can get in, get the job done. But over here, there's nothing. Well, I mean, what would you rather see? What would you rather attack, a lion or a house cat? Guess what? You're going to leave that lion alone. Guess what? A recruiting station should be that lion. Yeah, granted, a lot of those guys are not combat arms, MOSs, but hey, even on a civilian aspect, let them use their concealed carry. If they are allowed to conceal carry, let them use that. It's going to let these people know that hey, the U.S. forces are not to be messed with overseas, along with they're not supposed to be messed with over here. I mean, when are we going to take the nation's pride back and say, hey, we're not a force to be messed with? But you get these individuals that just feel that they can do whatever they want whenever they want, and they're particularly targeting armed service members when Congress, I mean, they've got armed guards all around them, but yeah, we can't defend our own.
Well said. I mean, the other one I was thinking about is, since you mentioned concealed carry, you can recognize that somebody who is lawfully concealed carry walks into a recruiting office and he is better armed than the military that he's talking to about whether or not he might want to join the military. So what's wrong with that picture? Yeah.
Exactly. And on my post, we have all kinds of automatic weapons, but we do not have one piece of ammunition. Not one piece. We have to drive to a different post to get ammunition.
Yeah, I know how that game's played. Yep. First of all, thank you for your service and very articulate comments. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, sir.
I'm just going to keep moving, not because anyone didn't have some good things to say, but I want to give as many of you a chance to ask or make a comment. And let's head out to Ohio again. In this case, WGGN. Tom, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I appreciate that. Hey, let's keep this simple in regard to arming the military. Let's just make the weapon part of the daily uniform, and then that'll send a clear message to the bad guys that we are prepared to address the situation if that unfortunate situation arises. Thank you.
Yeah, good point. Again, a lot of it gets back to deterrence. My favorite line, and you've heard me use it more than once, maybe it's getting old and I need a better one, is I've never seen a robbery at a gun store. Just never have. I mean, if I'm walking into a gun store or I walk into a gun range, and these people are packing, I just never see anybody going in there. Where do these happen? These happen in gun-free zones. I think we know this, but again, let's give some more of you a chance to join the conversation. Sam, you have the floor. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Hi, I'd just like to say that I'd like to ask a question to the legislators, the people that are pondering this question. Why do we judge the capabilities or the abilities of our military differently than civilians? I mean, I walk uptown. I have a concealed carry license. I pass by children, and I pass by school teachers and people of all walks of life. I'm trusted to do that in society because I've been trained with my concealed carry license. And but the military, we seem to revert back and say, well, how many times do they pick up a rifle, or how many times do they go to training? We don't judge them on the same playing field. To me, all these people are heroes. They've given up a substantial portion of their life voluntarily, with the possibility of having to defend our country, and yet we're going to give them a kind of a substandard form of judgment here.
Yeah, very good point.
And the other thing I'd like to say very quickly is, I'm from. I think that we should stop calling these people shooters. They're not shooters; they're murderers.
They're murderers. Good point. I have one of those mandatory breaks. I'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you don't get all of your comments in today, we certainly will have that opportunity tomorrow with our weekend edition. Let's head out to Nevada, KYCC. Sparky, you have the floor. What would you like to talk about?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say first, I'm a Christian. I believe the Bible, the Word of God, just, a man and a woman in marriage, nothing else. But what I want to say is the clients, I believe their name is the bakery shop. I believe they're wrong. I believe if you have a business and you're open to the public, you can't discriminate like that. It's just the world we live in. We know it's a fallen world. And, what are you going to do? Start discriminating if someone looks like a Jew or, interracial couple or, if you have a business, you're open to the public, you got, or get out of that business, That's my comment.
Well, and I think there's a good point to be made, because the argument that is being made right now is that because you're a public establishment, you have to serve all individuals. Yet we don't play the game consistently. If you, for example, were to come into a print shop and wanted to print pornography, you wanted to print something that you thought was offensive, was anti-Semitic or whatever, you could actually decline, and nobody would prosecute you for that. As a matter of fact, we've had some examples of Christians going into a bakery, for example, that where the individual was a particular homosexually owned establishment and wanted them to support traditional marriage, and they didn't. And of course, they didn't get prosecuted. But here's the line I make, Sparky. First of all, I think in most cases, I think Christians should serve even if they have some questions about it, because, again, civil disobedience or disobeying the government are going to be those particular cases where a direct and specific command, if obeyed, causes you to violate Scripture. My inclination, as I've heard some of our callers and guests say, is if somebody were to come in, let's say I had a bakery, and they'd say, I want us to celebrate a gay marriage. I'd say, well, I disagree with that, but I'll be glad to do it. But I want you to know I'm going to take all the profits from this, and I'm going to donate to the Focus on the Family or to a Liberty Institute or Point of View or something like that to make a point. I think that's a better way to go. That being said, I still think they should have the freedom to do that in the private sector, but they don't have that freedom in the public sector. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. Just imagine if somebody were working in the fire department, they pull up to a home and they find out that the home is burning, but it's a homosexual. And they go, well, I'm sorry, I disagree with that, so I'm going to let your house burn. We all would think that was just very inappropriate. So it's a tough question. And the point is, I think that in the case of Aaron and Melissa Klein, they weren't mean-spirited. They're just very nice people. But, again, they paid a heavy price. They had to close down their business and had to, on top of that, pay $135,000 in damages, and then they put a gag order on them. Somewhere along the line, I think it was overkill. But I appreciate you raising that question, because unlike some, I do believe that the line is a little fuzzy there. There's some places where I think if you're in the public sector, you have to. If you're in the government, even if you disagree with that, we can't have people opting out. But if you're owning your own business and you're not creating a hardship, because this couple just went down the street and got another bakery to do it. They were just doing this to teach a lesson to Aaron and Melissa Klein. But I appreciate you calling in. I think you got some good points there, and appreciate you taking the time to call us.
Real quick, in Acts, they had to preach the gospel. They told them not to. I mean, if it's something like that, then,
Acts 5:29. Yeah. I mean, when there's a direct and specific command, which, if obeyed, forces you to disobey Scripture, then I think we do exercise civil disobedience. And so I think there are some times, and I believe they're coming, frankly, when we're going to have to say no. So it's a good point.
Thank you.
Hey, appreciate you calling in. Good discussion, and let's get back to, of course, we put so many issues on the table. I hope we were not terribly confused today, because we're going to put a whole lot more issues tomorrow on the Friday program, but talking about the military personnel that aren't armed on the military bases. So let's go back to that conversation, and that's with Wayne in Kentucky. Wayne, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm good.
I am a U.S. Marine, and my suggestion to take care of that problem would be let's arm our NCOs, which would be E4s and up, which is a corporal. Those guys has got experience in training, and I can understand not arming everyone, but now our staff NCOs, our recruiting stations have those, so that would take care of that problem.
I think just a slight amendment to the Defense Department Directive 5110.56 would be to have those of that particular rank or higher. And I think that would solve the problem. At least one possible solution. So, hey, nothing else. Thank you for your service, and I appreciate you calling in today.
Oh, anytime. You have a good one.
Yeah, you call again. I'd love to hear from many of you that have served in the military, and those of you that serve in law enforcement. We appreciate you so very much. Let me just, before we run out of time here, spend a little bit of our scarce time left talking about the issues before us in terms of Planned Parenthood. We have a couple of the videos that have come down, and if you would like to watch them, I'm not recommending it, and I would not recommend that you watch them over lunch, even though these were done over lunch. Isn't it just amazing? But we do now on our website, pointofview.net, have the videos, and so you can watch either or both and get a sense of what they were like, so that if you have been hearing about them and you want to watch them, we can make those available to you. Simply go to the website, pointofview.net. My commentary today happens to be on abortion videos, and one of the things I encourage you to do is to maybe read the commentary or listen to the commentary. We have a share button, so you could put it on your Facebook page and start some conversation, because what I do is kind of give you some of the facts and figures about this, the fact that we spend every year $528 million of our taxpayer dollars to actually support Planned Parenthood. And that certainly makes me wonder whether or not we should defund them. I give you a few of the quotes from people like Dr. Deborah Nicotola. And, of course, then we have the other video with Dr. Mary Gatter. And so you have both of those. So there are some resources there. But then we also are encouraging you, if you would want to take the time to contact your 2 United States senators and your representative, click on the button that says Take Action. Then as you go through there, you will see that there is an opportunity then for you to put your name and address down, and that will then surface your 2 senators and your representative. You may know who they are, but I cannot tell you, in my experience, how many people don't know the name of their representative in the House of Representatives. Then we have a suggested message there, and you can change it if you want, or certainly keep it as it is. And then you just hit the word submit, and it now then goes to your 3 representatives, your 2 senators and your representative in the House of Representatives. And this is, I think, a great opportunity for us to get on the bandwagon, if you will, of what has been surfacing through these videos. And I believe there are more to come that come from the Center for Medical Progress. And recognize that these are just the latest ones. If you go back to Lila Rose and Live Action, and finding that they were willing to accept money so that they could increase the number of black babies that they would abort. If you can look at the cover videos where they found that they would not report statutory rape, you recognize that this is an organization that certainly needs to be investigated, and I think needs to be defunded, especially, as we pointed out just a few minutes ago, at a time when they're talking about not allowing groups that are pro-life any kind of funds because they're not providing abortion services. We'll have more to talk about that tomorrow, but again, if you want to find some of the resources we've been talking about today, you can find them on the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Matthew and Abby and Chris for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you tomorrow in our weekend edition.
Imagine you're in a room with 99 other people, 100 of you total. All of you listen to Point of View. You have that in common. What you don't have in common is that only one of you, actually less than 1 in 100, has ever supported the work of Point of View. That's what a recent study showed. 1 in 100. Fewer than 1% have given. 99% have not. You listen. So I know you appreciate what this program provides. Now, I invite you to move from the big group to the little one. If 1/3, 33% of those listening, gives just $5 this week, we could fully fund Point of View for a year, 12 months. Not everyone will, not everyone can, but can you give $5 today, or maybe $55 or $105? Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Join the few, the thankful. Support Point of View. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.